la tenemos en la mayoría de nuestros países, son las áreas protegidas privadas, y allí entonces, si se cumple con la equivalencia ecosistémica y con esta jerarquía, la autoridad podría considerar allí un portafolio de inversiones en compensación o en acciones de restauración o rehabilitación, como lo hemos dicho. Hemos avanzado, y esto no es para mirarlo en detalle, solo la gran visión, en un sistema geográfico georreferenciado donde ya las autoridades ambientales nos proveen de información sobre dónde hay posibilidad entonces de generar esas compensaciones. ¿Qué ha hecho BIOFIN para esto? Y ahorita en el Marketplace podemos hablar un poco más de esto, pero ya en estos 2 minutos 15 segundos que me queda contarles este proceso. Primero, desarrollamos todo un trabajo de investigación sobre los cuellos de botella, ¿no? Esos puntos que nos están generando problemas para que no se compense. Y aquí, por eso es bueno a veces contar la historia. En el 2012, nosotros tuvimos nuestro primer manual de compensaciones por pérdida de biodiversidad. Y a la fecha no se ha generado entonces la ejecución del primer plan de inversiones por compensación de biodiversidad. Las empresas han tenido una serie de conflictos, malos procesos, que es lo que nosotros estamos junto con el Ministerio ayudando entonces a aclarar. Entonces desatamos nudos para que esto pudiera entonces empezar a fluir. 5 como lecciones aprendidas para contribuir a este debate de hoy. Una baja coordinación entre las autoridades nacionales y regionales frente al esquema de compensación, primer cuello de botella. Segundo, que no hay una claridad sobre las líneas de inversión y la seguridad jurídica donde pueden invertir las empresas. Tercero, la poca disponibilidad de ecosistemas equivalentes que a veces encontramos. En Colombia uno de los ecosistemas más escasos que hoy tenemos es el bosque tropical seco. Y poder conseguir de nuevo un bosque tropical seco cuando se afecta, ahí es donde la jerarquía de mitigación cobra más valor. Oye, si vas a intervenir un bosque tropical seco y no hay dónde compensar, no se hace, se evita. No existe una articulación entre los diferentes instrumentos de planeación, como planea un municipio, un departamento, un ministerio o una empresa, y la administración de la biodiversidad y el diseño de los procesos productivos. ¿Cuál es nuestro mecanismo financiero en BIOFIN? Hemos creado y estamos en ese avance de un diálogo público-privado. Hemos entendido que esto no solo es una norma que sale de lo público, sino con privados, consolidar cuál es el mejor mecanismo. Promover el ajuste a esas metodologías que permitan dar viabilidad económica, como la aseguranza en biodiversidad del proceso. Implementar protocolos, es decir, lecciones aprendidas de los primeros que lo lograron, para que el siguiente ya dure menos en poder ejecutar un proyecto y ser aprobado un plan de compensaciones. ¿Me explico? Si a estos primeros que vamos a tener para el 2008 les tomó cerca de 4 años diseñar un plan de compensaciones, que a los que vienen después de este manual sea un tiempo muy inferior a eso, 1 año, y ojalá estemos pensando tal vez meses. Hoy en Colombia tenemos cerca de 130 millones de dólares represados en lo que podría ya estarse invirtiendo en los primeros planes de compensación. Y por último, el cuarto paso, crear entonces una plataforma de negocios. Por un lado tenemos unas empresas que requieren compensar y cualificar la oferta creando bancos de hábitat o lugares con todas las condiciones idóneas de seguridad jurídica, seguridad técnica y un sistema de monitoreo y evaluación que garantice que la inversión, obligada o no, que se haga en compensaciones, va a tener los resultados esperados. Eso es lo que buscamos entonces seguir en este paso de esta historia de Colombia. Muchas gracias.
Thanks very much, John. So as I said earlier, if you've got questions, please note them down and hold on to them for when all the talks are done.
Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about the biodiversity offset in Latin America and the Caribbean countries. And for that, I have a very short presentation that has 4 main ideas. The initial one, the first idea that I want to develop is the importance of biodiversity in the continent, in the region. The second one is the opportunity cost that the LAC country, the Latin America and the Caribbean country, are assuming by not paying attention to the offset mechanism. The third one is to review quickly the policy cycle of environmental impact assessment in the majority of the country. And the final one is to present the key idea of a regional project to improve the offset system in the region. First, the first slide to show the importance of the ecosystem and biodiversity are fundamental to the sustainable development of the region. In fact, if we take a look at the economy of the majority of the country of the region, we can observe that a large share of the GDP and the export depends on the biodiversity. Also, some of the findings from the BIOFIN, the first phase, we found out that we have a significant gap in financing biodiversity. If we include the 7 countries that participated in the BIOFIN first phase, we observed that we have $1 billion gap financing a year only for 7 countries. We are not including the 30 or more countries in the continent. Also, we found out that we have a limited use of economic or market instrument. Also, we discovered that many times the budget expenditure is inefficient, and we have a high dependence on international aid for financing biodiversity. Finally, we also discovered in this country that we have a highly potential economic instrument to address biodiversity that has been neglected. In this case, is the offset in biodiversity. I don't want to move to define the offset, given that John already did, but I just want to emphasize one aspect that for us is extremely important. It's the second one. Biodiversity offsets are based on polluter-pays approach by imposing costs on activities or projects, either private or public, that cause biodiversity loss. That's extremely important to see because it addresses the market failure in the environmental field. When we take a look to the region, we observe that in the majority of the Latin American and the Caribbean countries, we have environmental impact assessment systems in all the countries. One problem, the key problem, is that we have weak scheme for adequate biodiversity compensation. As you can see this information, and you compare the region with the rest of the other continent, you can see that the compliance in the offset by the year 2016 is very low compared to any other continent. And one of the key question here is, how can we provide technical underpinning and mobilize public and private commitment to improve biodiversity offset? And we think we have the answer. We have an idea to review very carefully the policy cycle of the offset process in challenges in the region. We divided this process in 4 phases. The first phase has to do with the environmental impact assessment, and we've observed here that we have an insufficient scheme for adequate biodiversity compensation coverage in terms of defining the minimum and the maximum of compensation. Also, when we take a look to the second phase of the policy cycle, as far as seeing the analysis and definition of the offset measure, we have a poor determining of ecological equivalence. This is a very challenging issue, as well as the additionality and the permanence of the solution of the offset measure. The third phase that has to do with the collection and transfer of funds, we have insufficient design operating model, compensation bank, or other forms, as well as high transaction costs. Finally, The last phase has to do with implementation and the impact evaluation. That is, what is the end result of what John was telling, the net gain? What is the net gain? One limitation that we have here is that we have a weak system of monitoring verification in general in the country, limiting the possibility of compliance and enforcement of the offset measure. In addition to that, we have the challenge to mobilize political will. Marlo Flores, I don't know where he's here, he's developing this methodology to look for quantitative evidence of the gap that we're confronting here as far as losing compensation measure. And the target scenario analysis is complementary. How we move to that? One way to move it is that in Latin American and the Caribbean country, the BIOFIN, we have been thinking about this regional project, developed the main idea of this regional project to address the key weaknesses of this policy cycle. The general purpose of the project is to increase private sector investment in biodiversity management through optimized environmental impact assessment system and biodiversity compensation mechanisms. Some of the expected result of this initiative, of this regional initiative, is to increase private sector financing for the Sustainable Development Goals, but also to mobilize private resources for management and conservation, as well as optimize the existing offset schemes, which are, as we showed before, they have many weaknesses. In addition to that, is to improve the institutional structure. And one idea here is that with this regional project, we can have an integral solution to the offset system in the region and resolve some of the neglected mechanisms that have been forgotten in many of the decisions of the country. And that's it. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to talk about the Mozambican experience which is just starting on offsets, explaining what we are doing, and eventually if this could be used in other places. And we'll find many similarities with what was shown here just before. So I don't know if you guys know Mozambique. So Mozambique is located in the southeastern Africa region. It's a huge country for Africa with a long coast and also an increasing population. So almost 30 million according to the last census. But and this population is completely dependent on around 70% is fully dependent on biodiversity and ecosystems for their livelihoods. And it happens that Mozambique is really a huge part of it's a biodiversity hotspot. It has got over 10,000 species of plants and animals, and actually 26% is covered by protected areas. However, most of these areas are just paper parks. Okay, so during the past 10 years, Mozambique has been increasing its investment, or the foreign investment in Mozambique in this case, with several natural resources being found, mining, extractive resources, basically minerals and oil and gas. And Mozambique has benefited a lot from bilateral and multilateral support. So all this led to an obligation from the private sector to comply with international standards. So aware of this, the WCS and the institution I represent and the World Bank, they have agreed to work together on trying to implement a strategy for achieving no net loss in the country based on the adequate application of the mitigation hierarchy, as it was here explained by John. So the World Bank provided support to develop this roadmap to achieve these goals, where this would make part of a larger strategy to fund protected areas, which are clearly underfunded in Mozambique. Whereas WCS has joined efforts with other partners, Forest Trends and Biotop, to work with the government and together with the private sector and civil society to implement what has been defined in this roadmap. And this based on adequate application of the mitigation hierarchy with all the steps that have been explained before. It happens that when the project started, other favorable conditions had already emerged. For example, the legal framework, the EIRA legal framework was already demanding for the adequate application of the mitigation hierarchy. This legislation was actually influenced by the project preparation, and also the demanding for biodiversity offsets for compensating for the residual impacts, also as a last resort, of course. And besides that, we have a conservation policy in place up to 2019, NBCEP approved, and Mozambique has adhered to several international conventions and declarations. Besides that, the current government 5-year plan, the fifth pillar is exactly about the sustainable use of natural resources and environment. And there's got a huge focus on biodiversity and ecosystem conservation. And also there are other projects going on which are complementary to combos, such as BIOFIN or the UNEP WCMC project Connect, which together they allow to create synergies. So clearly an opportunity arises here to develop a no net loss impact specific system, okay? We say impact specific because we are focused on development projects, you know, not biodiversity, no net loss for biodiversity in general. Okay, so what are we doing? So we have creating a MOU with the government, so we are working directly with the Ministry of Land, Environment and Rural Development. And we have a steering committee comprised by us, them, and also other partners such as BioFund, which is the local trust fund for biodiversity, with whom we have made also a specific MOU, and we have supported them on finding additional funding. And together we have now developed a joint work plan, and we have increased the regional combo budget in 70% joining these efforts. Besides that, as it was also mentioned here by John, we have created this technical advisory panel, which is comprised of around 50 institutions from all the sectors. So, I mean, public sector, okay, different ministries, the most important directorates, then the private sector, all represented, academia, civil society, donors, both bilateral and multilateral. One of them is BioFin, for example, and with some of them, so we kind of mapped the whole environment and try to gather the best partners to create additional synergies, such as BioFin, for example, and the Connect project from UNEP WCMC. So with this, we have started, so the project started in mid-2016. The previous year was mainly for gathering information, creating everything we need, and this year we are now developing the process to implement a biodiversity offset mechanism, which includes specific regulation, all the technical tools, and the baseline training. And this is the model we are creating. So these are the building blocks of this offset mechanism. So the baseline is the enabling environment. As it was said here before, you need to have this in place. So fortunately, in Mozambique, we have the policy and legal framework more or less into place. So what we are just adjusting is some laws and regulations, which fortunately are being revised by accident. So we are taking advantage of that, and we will create this specific regulation on the offsets, something that has already been assumed by the government. Then the biggest effort here is on all the technical frameworks, so this means tools and guidance to calculate the metrics, everything that you need for implementing an offset system, respecting the mitigation hierarchy. And a huge effort is being put on spatial planning, avoidance, okay? So that is the key for all this, as I will explain a little bit later, and as John has already put emphasis on. And then the financial mechanism, which fortunately we already have a biofund in the country. So this really is really favorable. So, and this is always based on the offsets principles, okay? So, and we highlight permanence, additionality, and equivalence. So now, how does this work? So we have different offset options. So this is a kind of, we are at the beginning, creating the first baseline, which will now be discussed throughout the year. It's a process involving all the stakeholders, but it's the priority number one is focus on enhancing biodiversity inside or outside protected areas. It can be outside protected areas in specific cases because, so the roadmap, just explaining the roadmap puts the emphasis on supporting protected areas. Because we also have a particularity in Mozambique, which is the land is from the state. It's not private land. There is no private land in Mozambique. It's concession for periods of 50 or 100 years, both to private or communities whatsoever. So it's kind of tough to develop, for example, a system for offset banking. However, because 26% of the country is already comprised of protected areas, completely underfunded, and without complying its conservation objectives, it has been highlighted as a priority. So, but areas outside there can also be chosen if these areas, there is no match between what is supposed to be offset and the potential offset areas. Especially areas which can then be promoted to protected areas, such as community conservation areas or so on. Then another option is to expand existing protected areas or creating new protected areas. There is also a fourth option, which we are studying, which is, you know, a specific fund for smaller projects which usually wouldn't have offsets but have residual impacts, and that these projects can contribute to a common fund to fund activities or plans that are already approved in the NBSEP. So then you have the project developer who needs to offset. He develops this preliminary biodiversity offset management plan, and he then interacts with this third party, which is a conservation trust fund. So this conservation trust fund not only is responsible for managing the financing of the offset, but also doing this matchmaking, which John has said. So they will do the matchmake between what are the needs from the developer to offset and the potential offset areas. So this means mapping everything at the beginning. And they also do all the oversight of the offset, including compliance and monitoring the evaluation, both because of the developer needs and so that all the system can work. Then with that, you can develop your biodiversity offset management plan, the final one, which will then be implemented by an offset developer, which will be chosen according to each case, and a project-specific steering committee, which is fundamental to guarantee the independence and the validity of the mechanism. And of course, you need to have the regulator, which is the government, and which an institution from the government, which will make sure everything complies with what it's supposed to. So, okay, when this will be operational? Well, it's being developed right now. We are really putting our efforts on having to finish it by the end of this year, so that it can be regulated early next year. And look, this is a phased project, you know, because then you need to learn by doing, you know, it's kind of a data management. We need to learn with our mistakes, as Colombia has also done, and we hope to learn with you guys. And it implies this phased work and training. So, you know, Combo is a 4-year project. It won't be able to do everything during this period, but we hope that we can continue after the project finishes, you know, to test the model, to validate it, and to improve it. Well, can this be replicated? Each case is a case, you know, for offsets, for countries. Each country is different. So, but I'm sure there are lessons that can be learned and used elsewhere, and vice versa. Okay, so what are the major issues to consider? You know, it's very, very important that the governments build these frameworks, for the adequate compliance of mitigation hierarchy and allow for the offsets if that's the decision of the country. If the government set the playing field, then it will be much easier for the companies to comply with. The environment will be much more stable. And of course, the different stakeholders must be engaged. As it was explained here by John, that they realized about that also in Colombia, and are making efforts on that. So it's really important. And if you kind of harmonize this with this international good practice, it will also be much easier for the companies, because most of them already supposedly need to comply with it. And of course, spatial planning, avoidance, it's key. We need to identify, in such a system needs to identify which areas need to be avoided, which areas can be used as for offsetting. Only with such a system you can work with, and at the same time align this with the NBCEPs of the country, contribute to a common goal. Okay, so coming up to the end. What I'm going to tell you is nothing is new for you, especially for those who are working with offsets. John has raised some issues about this. But what I like to put emphasis on is that this is based on also on my personal experience. I'm working in conservation compensation since 2007 with projects on the ground. And these lessons are drawn from those examples on the ground. First one, mitigation hierarchy, avoidance. It's in the books, but it's the reality. If you don't do that, if you don't put emphasis on this, then we are fooling ourselves, because we are not complying with what we should. And most of the critics come out of this, okay? So we need to put emphasis on this and guarantee that those areas are mapped, and that the system, the EIA process, complies with that. Aggregated offsets as opposite to project-specific offsets. The projects I've worked in were all project-specific. And I can tell you, although they might have worked for that specific project, in terms of the country, they didn't contribute for anything at all. If you have an aggregated system, that will allow you to focus on the priorities of the country. That is the solution. Operationalization of the offsets before the impact occurs. If you don't do that, there is a huge risk that, if you facilitate companies, they are, it's about money. It's the private sector or even the public sector. So you try to avoid the expenditure of money as the most you can. And problems can happen, I've seen projects that have completely stopped because of economical problems, operational problems, etc. And if the offsets hadn't started before, it would have been a huge crisis, and it was. In this case, it really was. So this is really important. Another one is community involvement and participation. I've worked in projects where communities were engaged, and because they were participating in the offset, at a certain stage when they saw that this was really improving also in this case it was not their livelihoods, it was about hunting areas and so on, they decided to apply to fundings to promote themselves the same type of actions. So they expanded the extent of the offset by their own. So this guarantees sustainability. And then, of course, focus on monitoring and auditing. This is fundamental. If you don't focus on monitoring, you don't know the success of the implementation of your project. And if you are talking about offsets, we need to talk about outcomes, okay? Conservation outcomes, because that's the definition, which is shown in the presentation just before mine. So you need to guarantee different levels of monitoring during your process, and auditing, because if you don't audit the companies, even if the company has got a good policy on environmental policy or biodiversity policy, come on, we know how it works. If there is not a proper auditing, they will fail somehow, okay? And lastly, adaptive management, okay? Learning by doing, learning with what we are implementing, having management plans that are able to be adapted according to what we are learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugo. And last but very far from least, our expert speaker, Katya.